My name is Maryam Janani-Flores, and I am the Deputy Policy Director here at the Washington Center for Equitable Growth. Our mission is to advance evidence-based ideas and policies that promote strong, stable, and broadly shared growth. We catalyze research that investigates whether and how inequality in all its forms affects economic growth and stability, and ensure the results of that research informs policymaking. In fostering that bridge between academia and the policymaking community, we hope to get closer to our goal of addressing economic inequality and delivering broad-based economic growth to communities and families. A goal that has become even more evident in light of the coronavirus pandemic and overlapping racial, climate, and care crises our nation currently faces. The pandemic and resulting economic shock continue to reveal underlying systemic weaknesses driven by economic inequities and made worse by racial and gender disparities. And we are not out of the woods yet. The recovery is still ongoing, and broadly shared economic growth is not a given. It will take smart, deliberate policy choices to create a pathway towards a more resilient and inclusive US economy and society. And it is these choices that our wide range of speakers will discuss in depth across the next 2 days. The panelists you will hear from across these sessions will help us outline a vision for a stronger economic future for all Americans, one that is built on sustained public investment in structures and institutions that take into account linkages that can make or break our economy, from racial justice to climate resilience, access to care and family economic security, to financial stability and rebalancing power. By the end of these 2 days, we hope you will come away energized by exciting new ideas with which we can build an equitable economic future. Before we launch into our sessions, a few housekeeping notes to keep in mind. Technical or logistics questions and conversations about the event can go into the chat box. Today, there will be 2 question and answer periods. The first will follow the fireside chat between Equitable Growth President and CEO, Michelle Holder, and Steering Committee member, Lisa Cook, professor at Michigan State University. The second Q&A will be at the conclusion of US Secretary of Labor, Marty Walsh's remarks. All content-related questions should go in the Q&A box on your screen. And in the Q&A box when asking questions, please give your first and last name along with your institution or workplace. And please note, you don't have to wait until the Q&A part of the sessions to start sending in your questions. We'll have the Q&A box open at the start of each session, so as questions come to you, feel free to drop them in the Q&A box. Lastly, this event is on the record and is being recorded. We encourage you to engage in the conversation with each other in the chat box and on Twitter with the hashtag #EquitableGrowth. Now that we have all of that taken care of, I think we can get started with our first exciting session in conversation with Michelle Holder. Equitable Growth for a More Equitable Future. Michelle Holder is the new president and CEO of Equitable Growth. She is an associate professor at John Jay College, City University of New York. Her research focuses on the Black community and women of color in the US labor market. Named one of 19 Black economists to watch by Fortune magazine, Dr. Holder has authored 2 books, including African American Men in the Labor Market During the Great Recession in 2017, and most recently, Afro-Latinos in the US Economy, published in May 2021. Dr. Holder has been a faculty member at the City University of New York since 2014. Prior to joining CUNY, Dr. Holder spent a decade working as an applied economist in the nonprofit and government sectors, including as senior labor market analyst at the Community Service Society of New York and an associate financial analyst and economist at the Office of New York State Comptroller. She has served for nearly 7 years as finance director at Demos. She holds a PhD and an MA in economics from the New School for Social Research, an MPA from the University of Michigan, and a BA in economics from Fordham University. Hosting the conversation will be Dr. Lisa Cook, member of Equitable Growth's Steering Committee and professor of economics and international relations at Michigan State University. Prior to this appointment, Dr. Cook was on the faculty of Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government, Deputy Director for Africa Research at the Center for International Development at Harvard University, and a National Fellow at Stanford University. Dr. Cook was the first Marshall Scholar from Spelman College and received a second BA in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics from Oxford University. She earned a PhD in Economics from the University of California, Berkeley, with fields in Macroeconomics and International Economics. With that, I am pleased to welcome Lisa Cook and Michelle Holder to the virtual stage.
Thank you for that very kind introduction, Maryam. I am so excited to be here for Equitable Growth 2021. Michelle, I'd like to congratulate you again on recently becoming the new president and CEO at Equitable Growth. We are so lucky. Can you speak? Sure. Can you speak to what attracted you to Equitable Growth mission and your vision for the next chapter at Equitable Growth?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Lisa. And thank you as well, Maryam, for that terrific introduction. I will answer Lisa's question momentarily, but I just want to say how thrilled I am to be leading this amazing organization. And I want to thank all of the panelists and all of the attendees so much for contributing to what we're sure will be a great conference. So in answer to Lisa's question, I think the thing that attracted me most to Equitable Growth is its formula to see long-term structural change so that the economy really benefits us all. The organization's formula is not only to internally produce solid research, which outlines the ways in which inequality may affect growth and what could be done about that, but also to cultivate scholars who are also concerned with the relationship between inequality and growth, and to elevate their research in an accessible way to policymakers and advocates. Because I'm a labor economist whose expertise lies in the area of examining the role race and gender play in labor market outcomes in the US, I would have to say that my goal and vision is first and foremost to build upon this winning formula by increasing the ways in which equitable growth drives narratives about the outsized roles racial and gender stratification play in inequality in our work and in the work we choose to elevate, and to actively highlight the implications for these ideas and policies for ameliorating racial and gender marginalization. And Lisa, may I ask you a question?
Sure. Yes.
Yes. So Lisa, my question for you is, how did you first get involved with Equitable Growth? And what direction are you excited for Equitable Growth to go?
That's a good question. And in 2013, I was grateful and honored that Heather Boucher approached me. Heather Boucher, who was the first CEO of Equitable Growth, to serve on the research advisory board of Equitable Growth, to set the research direction of the entity, and then to serve on the steering committee. I believed, like the founders of Equitable Growth, and as you've already outlined, that there is a role, a big role, an important role for translating and supporting academic research that seeks to inform public policy. Absolutely an important role. I am particularly excited about the work that Equitable Growth is doing in conjunction with UC Berkeley's Institute for Research on Labor and Employment, and putting forward research that provides a framework for boosting wages and raising standards of living now and in the future. I am also excited about the way Equitable Growth sheds light on monetary policy as a way for the public and policymakers to understand its challenges and opportunities. It can be obscure sometimes, so I really appreciate Equitable Growth investing in this line of research. This is a unique and timely public service. Finally, I hope your research, I know we're going to talk about it in a minute, but I hope your research, Michelle, gets integrated into the work of Equitable Growth. The more light is shed on various groups in the economy, such as the Afro-Latinx community, the more light is shed on the entire economy. So I'm excited about that potential integration. So let's pivot back to you, Michelle. I wanted to focus on this body of research that I just alluded to. Can you explain what your research interests are and how you see your research helping inform Equitable Growth's mission. How has your personal experience shaped your research?
So thank you for that, Lisa. So as I mentioned before, my interests really lie in looking at, primarily as a labor economist, the labor market outcomes of groups that tend to be disfavored in the American labor market, such as people of color and women and immigrants, etc. Lisa did mention my latest book, co-authored piece with Dr. Alan Aha, who is a professor at Brooklyn College. He and I just published a book, the title being Afro-Latinos in the US economy, where we wanted to look at how this particular community is situated in the United States with regard to several different economic outcomes, including labor market, poverty, educational attainment, etc. And, you know, one of our, I think a theme of our book is really that, I'm going to just give you the punchline, that Blackness matters. But let me explain what that means. So, you know, when you talk about labor market outcomes, for example, for Black Americans, you know, one of the things that, or one of the perhaps critiques someone like me might encounter is, well, perhaps, you know, it isn't the fact that, you know, ascriptively you're a Black person. It might be, you know, other factors which contribute to, you know, in an overall sense, right, outcomes that are, you know, not quite as good as for other groups. But what the research that both Dr. Aha and I found is that even for Latinxes in the United States, being Black apparently does matter. It is, according to our research, it's very clear that on most major, on most economic outcomes, the Afro-Latinx community experiences disparities when compared to the broader Latinx community. And in, you know, in many ways, it really can only be ascribed to the fact that they self-identify for the most part as being both Black and Latinx. And so what in terms of my work at Equitable Growth, I want to absolutely infuse narratives about the roles, and really the outsized roles, that racial stratification and gender stratification play in many different dimensions of economic inequality in our country. In fact, narratives that don't include that, I find, are incomplete. So, you know, researchers and economists can do great work on competition, on family economic security, on mobility, absolutely on wages, and, you know, perhaps not talk about either race or gender. The work is good, it's interesting, it's you know, well researched, but from my perspective, it's incomplete, because I think in the United States, you simply can't really tell a complete story about inequality and inequities without discussing race and without discussing gender. I think you can have a story without those elements, but the story is incomplete. Mm-hmm.
No, thank you. Thank you so much for that, Michelle. That's, I am so excited about how this integration collaboration will go forward. Your research couldn't have been more timely.
So Lisa, may I ask you about your work?
Sure.
Okay, so I'm definitely interested to hear about your own research. One of the things you did some fantastic work on is African American patent holding. Can you describe to us that research as well as other things you're currently working on?
Absolutely. So The origin of this work, I think, is as important as the outcome of this work. I was writing my dissertation in Russia, and I was writing it on banking in the Wild West period during the 1990s. And as I was interviewing bankers and entrepreneurs, they were asking me, so you're a budding economist at the University of California, Berkeley, tell us why innovation can't get going in this economy. And they had intellectual property rights on the books. They thought they were protecting them. Why wasn't innovation getting going? And the reason they were worried is because, as you know, this is foundational for economic growth. So I said, I can't answer it now. I've got a dissertation to finish. Maybe I can come back to you later. Well, I finished my dissertation and this question kept gnawing at me. Why did they have all of these structures? The literature said you needed to have in place sufficient conditions for invention and innovation to get going, and they weren't seeing it. So I wondered if there were an historical experiment that might elucidate what they were experiencing. Well, what they were experiencing and what I saw at the time was random violence, for example, bankers being killed, others being killed, these oligarchs coming up and taking the resources of the Soviet Union. So I thought about an historical experiment. I didn't need to look far. What about the patentees or inventors who were African American? And what happened to them? The intellectual property rights would have been the same. The intellectual property environment would have been the same for Black inventors and white and other inventors. But it was the African American inventors who were shocked by, though this is the turn of the late 19th century, early 20th century, who were shocked by racial massacres, by lynchings, and by segregation laws. So I had an open question there. So how did they affect patenting? And this is, again, going to be fundamental to economic growth. And what I saw was that they were really detrimental to patenting. Segregation, for example, was most affected electrical patents, which at the time were the most valuable ones. So this is something that I am concerned with, not just the representative agent, as we like to look at in macroeconomics, but different groups in the population. And there was a bigger story, just like you have a bigger story in your book. I had a bigger story. When I gave this paper, the people who are the ones who come up to talk to me about it and get it intuitively and ask lots of questions about it are from Russia, Ukraine, from China, from places where the rule of law has been dicey in the recent past. So this is not just something stuck in the past. When we think of inventors, we think of George Washington Carver, we think of people who were dead. And they are not dead, they are living and they're contributing. So it has a portion that is historical and a portion that informs what we are doing now with respect to promoting innovation. And I want to thank Equitable Growth for all the times I've testified before Congress about this. This work is being turned into legislation, into the Success Act, and helped inform the IDEA Act with respect to gender and racial disparities in patenting and innovation. But I really appreciate the Equitable Growth support of all of that research and helping and translate that research.
Fantastic.
So before we go, I know our time is getting short. I just wanted to touch on the importance of the current moment and the implications for the future. The pandemic continues to expose deep fragilities in our economy, including racial and gender inequities, that economic policymakers have a once-in-a-generation opportunity to address. During this recovery effort, there's been a real focus on investing in social infrastructure. What excites you about the current moment and the future? Michelle.
Yes, thank you, Lisa. I think one of the things that really excites me most, I would say, about the current moment and the future is that we do have a presidential administration that I feel is genuinely interested in seeing the lives of most people in this country improve. You know, one could debate about this, but clearly one of the main mechanisms in this country for social change is through action on the part of our government, right? Sometimes we as citizens or residents, as advocates, as organizations, sometimes we have to push, we have to assist, we have to request, or even demand that change. But I think right now, our government, our federal government is listening. It can't do everything necessarily, but I am happy that we have an administration that at a minimum acknowledges that our economy is not working well for everyone. And that even acknowledging that, you know, there's the saying, you know, the first step in solving a problem is acknowledging that it even exists. In our government's acknowledgement that there are problems in terms of inequities in our society along racial, ethnic, gender, different dimensions, class, educational attainment, in acknowledging that, it excites me because it tells me that there is an opportunity to have not just a dialogue about what can we do to change this, but that that our government is now open to action. So I find that quite exciting.
No, I think you really hit the nail on the head. I mean, the social infrastructure is part of has been exposed to be inadequate. Right. I mean, I think day by day we get, I think literally day by day during this pandemic, we've gotten more and more evidence of these structural inequalities associated with social infrastructure. So I, like you, am excited that someone is acknowledging this and someone is putting forward great ideas to address it. And certainly, I'm sure, given the work that Equitable Growth has commissioned that you all support, the grants that you've extended recently and in the recent past, there's more research to come on issues like this. Not necessarily exactly what the administration is looking at, but the broad range of social infrastructure. So certainly want to thank you in advance for supporting that work and continuing to support that work. So now I'll turn to questions from the audience. I think that's what I am tasked with doing. Let me just make sure. Let's see. Okay. All right. So we do have a few questions awaiting us. So how do we account for power and rights when we think about equitable growth? For example, how does political capture, such as corporations influencing the laws that govern the tax code that lead to growing income inequality, influence what policy we focus on? Likewise, how do we think about growing voter disenfranchisement and how that relates to who is in power and whose interests are represented? This is from Liz Carty from Oxfam America.
Yeah, a great question. So with regard to voter disenfranchisement, I will say that's not exactly an area in Equitable Growth's wheelhouse. However, we are quite clear that not every citizen or resident in this country is either allowed to vote or able to exercise their right to vote. And that obviously has a deleterious impact with regard to which policies will be implemented. So as an example, in many states in this country, if you've been convicted of a felony crime and served your time, you lose the right to vote. And so this, of course, leads to, voter disenfranchisement among, a large swath of Black and Brown communities that encounter disproportionately higher incarceration rates, particularly among the men in those communities, because 90% of the incarcerated in the US are men. And so, looking at it from the Black community's perspective, there are, hundreds of thousands of Black American men who have encountered and has the burden of voter disenfranchisement. And so in some ways, the policies that we focus on are meant to acknowledge that there are some groups whose voices will not be heard, right? Some voices that have been excised from the public discourse. And so, let me put it to you this way. In terms of the policies that we advocate for, that we support, that we elevate, if these policies are meant to address, fissures in our society along demographic lines and other lines, certainly these policies should have positive implications for those communities as well if they are implemented. And so even though, and just hearkening back to the first part of your question that Lisa expressed, corporations also, right, having and large donors having outsized influence in terms of our political process. Our job at Equitable Growth is to do our best to ensure that marginalized voices are heard, even if we have to be that vehicle by which their concerns are heard. So I affirm that there on the one hand are certain entities that have outsized power with regard to our political process and our legislative process, and on the other hand, large swaths of people excluded from being active participants in that process. But with Equitable Growth as an organization, recognizing those things, we try to serve in some ways as the voice of the voiceless in making sure that policies that would affect the latter community gets to the people who can do something about it.
Well said, well said. I think we can both possibly tackle this question, Michelle. How do we make the macroeconomic case for tackling racial disparities? Does racial and economic inequality hurt growth overall? So why don't you go first on that one?
Oh wow! At least I was going to kick it over to you as the
I'll go first. You take a breather because you gave a very complete answer to that last question.
Sure.
So I'll just go back to the question you were posing, Michelle, about my research. I published this in the Journal of Economic Growth. It is an economic growth question. How do we get more people to participate in innovation such that we augment growth? And if you're not including everybody, that means that you're not using all of the resources of the economy. We're not being good stewards of the economy. So my co-author Yan Yang and I estimate that the GDP per capita would be 0.6% to 4.4% higher if there were more women and more African Americans participating in the innovation process. So that's leaving a lot of money on the table. So I am just suggesting that, of course, there is a deleterious effect, a negative effect of not using the resources that are available, especially when we might anticipate that GDP might start growing more slowly, for example, just because of demographic factors, just because of an aging population, for example, or just because mature industrialized countries grow more slowly than other countries. So we should do everything we can to get people into that process and into the project of economic growth in this country. Michelle?
Sure. So I'd like to give a concrete example of a scenario such as the one based on the question being posed. So, I think most of the folks at this conference, and certainly, everyone on our side of the table in terms of putting on this conference, we're aware that the pandemic and the cyclical downturn that resulted disproportionately affected women, right? Women in the earlier part of the pandemic experienced the highest unemployment rates. We know that, or some of us know that even currently, the labor force participation rate of women has gone down, and it's gone down proportionally more than it has for men. So when we look at that, and if we disaggregate that, along racial and ethnic lines, what we actually see is that it's been Black and brown women who have left the labor force in great numbers. White women have also left the labor force, but proportionally more Black and brown women have left the labor force. And we also know and or suspect that much of that has to do with the caregiving crisis that resulted from the pandemic and the downturn, having to do with school openings and the bumpy road thereof with that. So I'd like for us all to think about, what does it mean for an economy when 2 to 3 million women withdraw from the labor force? It means that our GDP would not be as high as it would have been had these women not left the labor force. And we can trace a lot of these departures to the difficulties that women in particular encountered in the American workforce as a result of the pandemic, not just in terms of women being overrepresented in the service sector, which was the sector that got really hit very, very hard by the pandemic. But so that's a concrete example of an outcome that I think most, or if not all of us, would agree is really not good for the economy. We don't want people leaving the economy writ large. We don't want women leaving the labor force in the millions or in the hundreds of thousands. That's not good for productivity. That's not good for growth. So this is one of the things that I envision equitable growth digging deeper into, in terms of the loss, at least during this current period, of millions of women from the labor force, hundreds of thousands of which are Black and brown women.
That's really a serious concern for the macroeconomy. And again, it's almost trite to say that these disparities being exposed is unprecedented. They've been there. They've been there, right?
Yep.
But their exposure and people's learning about them, and now us trying to do something about them, is unprecedented. So this is really an auspicious moment. The next question is, it was exciting to hear about being on the cusp of change in terms of social infrastructure. What are the implications of current policy proposals for economic growth? What are you most excited about? So maybe we can pick one current proposal, because I know you are the president and CEO, and you have a wide sense of the landscape, but let's just pick one, not all of them.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think the work we've been doing in our family economic security program has been really spot on with regard to the needs that individuals and families are now facing as a result of the pandemic and the cyclical downturn and the recovery. And particularly as regards childcare issues, I think, one of the most exciting things that Equitable Growth has been talking about, writing about, sounding the horn about is really this childcare crisis that we face in this country. We all, before the pandemic occurred, a lot of, I would say most American families, individuals and families with children knew that, childcare is a particularly challenging thing for many families in terms of affordability and accessibility. Those challenges were really exposed and highlighted during the course of the pandemic and the downturn. So the work that we've been doing with regard to making childcare more accessible, more affordable, and also really situating it within the context that childcare, it's not just about families, but it's also about, it really is about our economy and enabling people to be full participants in our economy. 1/3 of working women in this country are mothers. And so this is, the issue of, particularly for preschool children, of, how to find appropriate childcare to enable an individual or family to engage productively in our society. It's a big challenge, and I think it's one that we've really been addressing in our FES, our Family Economic Security Program.
And I think one of the things that is also important, and I think this comes with the name that Equitable Growth has given it. This is just a crisis in the care economy in general. I mean, talk about highlighting the care for the elderly. I mean, we're underpaying the people who are supposed to take care of our most vulnerable loved ones, whether they be children or whether they be the elderly. And that was unsustainable. And my sense is that this light being shown on both those groups will help us think more broadly about the actual cost of supporting women in the workforce. And they disproportionately do the care work. So I'm not just saying women, because I know these stories and know this anecdotally, but certainly I think that it is great that Equitable Growth is focusing on the family. Let's see, there's a question about labor unions. Let me get to that. Where do you see the role of labor unions, the role labor unions can play in narrowing inequality by recruiting women and minorities, given the fact that the current administration is pro-labor and promoting pro-labor policies?
Yeah, I think unions are incredibly important. I am absolutely pro-union. In fact, Equitable Growth has become a unionized organization just recently. I'm not exactly part of the union, but that's okay. I am part of the union at John Jay College, City University of New York. I'm a union for somewhere. But in seriousness, it is unfortunate that, if we plotted unionization rates for this country over the last several decades, both in the, the private sector as well as the public sector, primarily in the private sector, you would just simply see a downward trajectory, right? That you are just going down, and there appears to be, no sort of semblance of an upturn in that trajectory. It's unfortunate because, unions have been, I think, an integral part in terms of raising wages and sort of work standards for people who this country.
Mhm.
An incredible role can be attributed to unions in terms of, many of the things we enjoy today, such as the 8-hour workday, et cetera, et cetera. So I think unions are critical, crucial, and an important institution in this country. And, I don't mean to suggest that it is necessarily a dying one. It is one that does not have as much, let's say, gravitas as it used to, simply because unionization rates have been on the decline. However, I think that, I'm not a union official, but I think that if there can be sort of a reinvigoration of union movements in this country, I think it would go a very long way in helping to improve many of the outcomes we currently talk about at Equitable Growth as regards workers and families.
So can I ask just a quick question? I know we're coming up on the end of our time, but just to piggyback on that, it seems to me, and I just wonder if you think similarly, Michelle, that the case for unions is being made whether or not workers are asking for unions themselves. They're asking for the protections that unions typically bring with them and have advocated for, and that you mentioned in terms of economic history. They're looking not just for wage raises, right? They're looking for, I think the folks at Google were looking for just a better workplace climate. They weren't asking for a higher salary. They were looking for those kinds of protections. So I think the case is being made in other ways more pointedly than in recent memory.
I would agree with you completely. Mm-hmm.
That's, I think in that regard, I think it's a really important moment. I know that we are about to be the subjects of that little cane that comes across at the Apollo. I know you're based in New York typically, so we know about that cane. So I don't want us to be dragged off the stage. So I think we'll wrap it up here and just thank the audience for these great questions. And thank you so much, Michelle, and best of luck to you and best of luck to Equitable Growth.
And thank you, Lisa. I'm so thrilled to join Equitable Growth, partly because I'll be working with you. So
same here, same here, same here.
Thank you.
Fantastic.
Well, thank you, Michelle and Lisa, for kicking this conference off with that amazing fireside chat, and especially with that last Q&A really setting us up nicely for this next session. Now, I get to have the honor of introducing our next speaker for a keynote address, the United States Secretary of Labor, Marty Walsh. Secretary Walsh was sworn in as the 29th U.S. Labor Secretary on March 23rd, 2021. Prior to leading the Department of Labor, Secretary Walsh spent over 2 decades as a public servant in Massachusetts. In 1997, he was elected to serve as a state representative for one of the most diverse districts in the state, where he focused on creating good jobs, protecting workers' rights, expanding mental health treatment, and investing in public transit. After that, Secretary Walsh spent 7 years as the mayor of the city of Boston. As mayor, he led the creation of close to 140,000 jobs and helped secure a statewide minimum wage of $15 per hour, paid sick leave, and paid parental leave, as well as universal high-quality pre-kindergarten for all children and free community college for low-income students. I am very pleased to now welcome Secretary Walsh.
Thanks, Maryam, and I appreciate that introduction. Let me just make sure I'm hooked in here right. I am hooked on. Mute's off. I'm in good shape. Okay. Sorry about that. I caught a little of the last panel, and it was a great conversation. And I want to thank this organization and the community around it. Certainly, we've helped build research infrastructure that addressed directly to the challenge of our time. And that last conversation is very pertinent to what we're dealing with and what we're doing here in our country right now. And it puts us in a stronger position to meet this moment, particularly all the great work that you're doing there. So I want to thank you all for having me today. It's such an honor to be here. Your impact is certainly felt in the Department of Labor. You have appointed leaders who whose research you have supported in the past, including our chief economist, Janelle Jones. Janelle's probably on watching or listening. Thank you, Janelle. She does amazing work in the DOL and policy deputy, Alexander Hertel Fernandez. I want to thank her as well for her great work. And now they're helping lead our work on understanding the movement and the moment that we're in. And it has to be a movement in the federal government so we can respond in the appropriate manner, particularly after this year. This moment certainly is defined by a crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic. As you all know, the pandemic exposed and exacerbates long-term problems that are just as urgent: stagnant wage and increased inequality. We saw a decline in union density, a loss of worker empowerment, racial and gender disparities in employment, income, wealth have continued, and in some cases gotten even worse. And these issues were pre-pandemic, but I think in a lot of cases they've got worse during and now. I wouldn't say after the pandemic yet, but during and heading towards hopefully the end of the pandemic. Climate change is harming our environment and our most vulnerable workers all across the country and all across the globe. Our future depends not only getting through a pandemic, but it depends on addressing these problems. President Biden has been very clear and taken on this challenge directly with a comprehensive agenda, and he's calling it Build Back Better, and you can see what he means by that. As a cabinet member, we're charged with supporting our workforce, and I'm committed to an equitable recovery. That's really important for us here in this country. It's time to restore the balance. I tell the story a lot, and my parents are immigrants. My father came from Ireland, this country, in the 1950s with very little education and hardly any money in his pocket. But he found power by joining with fellow workers, a union. He joined the laborers union. That allowed my father and mother to join the middle class and invest in their communities. And their economy grew and our economy grew. And then that was in the 50s and 60s and 70s. And then we saw that decline in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. We need to rebuild our middle class. We need to make sure that it's open for everyone. And we have to make sure, just like my father had the opportunity to get to join the middle class, we need to restore that and get back to that point here in this country. At the Department of Labor, I've been asked a lot about, what do we do? Like, what's our job? What's our main priority? What do we, and we thought about it for a little bit. And quite honestly, at the end of the day, our work at the Department of Labor is about empowering all workers morning, noon, and night. That means we have to focus on traditional workplace concerns and go beyond them. So in the morning, it means valuing care as an economy. Workers need quality childcare and family services just to get out the door in the morning and focus on their careers. And the lack of care infrastructure is a major barrier to women's labor participation and a major contributor to the wage gap here in our country. Noon means building an inclusive workforce with good jobs in every community available to all workers. That means living wages, good benefits, strong protections, access to training, the right to organize and join a union. And when I talk about living wages, I'm talking about living wages and real good middle-class wages as well. And to cite one piece of data, research that Alex found did an equitable growth before joining DOL to show that nearly half of all non-union workers are interested in joining the union. Being empowered at night means having a peace of mind that your health care is there, your retirement is going to be secure, and there's support available for career transitions. It has to be a lifetime of empowerment. To have this kind of impact with equity, with high quality research data, we need to continue to follow that data. We need rigorous evidence to understand inequities for different populations in our country. We need to design programs that target our resources equitably across the board. And we need to figure out how our programs are impacting the workers that we serve. And that's really what we have to do. So we're drawing on academic, nonprofit, and government research to look at all this work. And we're applying it in every single area of our work, from wage enforcement to job training grants to unemployment reform to worker safety health. And in many cases, it's the same research that informs the president's economic agenda as the president is moving his agenda forward here. And that's really, really important for us as we think about that. The common theme is empowering workers and doing it with equity. It has a positive impact across our economy. Just one example, the bipartisan infrastructure bill will create millions of good jobs and make needed improvements in all of our communities. And it will have the biggest impact in communities that lack the basic resources like clean drinking water and clean water and broadband. And that will help the marginalized workers find good jobs and grow local economies. And we need to make sure that we do it right, that's the really important piece of it as we think about moving forward. Another example is investing in the cares economy. And when we talk about that, it means paid family and medical leave, which will allow millions of women to enter and stay in the labor market, strengthening our workforce. During the pandemic, we saw about 4 million women were pushed out of the workforce, completely left the workforce. Roughly, depending on who you talk to, 2 million women have come back. We still have about 2 million women outside the workforce. And a big issue is the cares economy. So it's important that we strengthen our workforce. And, the president's proposal would invest in the cares economy were primarily women, people of color, and immigrants. Currently, 1 in 6 of women and people of color live in poverty, despite working full-time jobs. Those workers would be able to join the middle class and put more money into our economy, and quite honestly, more money into their family, which should be great. This is a challenging moment, but it's a hopeful moment as well. We have an administration in Washington, President Biden and Vice President Harris, that's committed to moving forward with all these issues, every single one of them. We have a growing body of high quality research that shows empowering workers' strengths and will overall help and benefit our economy. So I want to thank you again for the work that you're doing and the conversation you're having today. These are important conversations. We need to continue to have these conversations. We can't run away from these conversations. We need to run towards these conversations. And I look forward, I guess I'm going to be trying to answer a few questions for you. So with that, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for those engaging insights on how we as a country can and should be supporting our workers. While folks are busy typing their questions into the Q&A box, I have one to get us started, and it's about some news that just broke. Today, the White House announced that the Occupation Safety and Health Administration, or OSHA, will start the rulemaking process to create a standard that protects workers from heat-related safety hazards. I know Equitable Growth has funded related research which found that there are growing safety risks of excessive heat for U.S. workers. So, Mr. Secretary, can you speak to what OSHA is hoping to accomplish with this rule, and in general, how the Department of Labor sees its work in light of the growing effects of climate change?
No, absolutely. And I think that everyone on this call knows that, but just so you understand, heat is an important workplace hazard that will become more critical as the impacts of climate change progress over time. There's no questions about it. We're seeing more hurricanes, we're seeing more wildfires, we're seeing the floods that produce dramatic images of devastation on TV when we watch the nightly news, when we see these hurricanes and flooding coming in. While extreme heat often takes place and is out of sight, out of the news. But heat is the nation's leading weather-related killer. Every year, thousands of workers all across our country, lose their life, get ill or lose their life because of heat. Workers in agriculture and construction are at the highest risk, but it can happen anywhere and everywhere, quite honestly. I also want to thank the Center for Equitable Growth for the work that you've done on researching heat hazards and their impacts on workers in this country. It's great. It's great work. Employers are responsible for providing workplace free of known safety hazards, including extreme heat. And OSHA has been working, I was on a call this morning with my team at OSHA, and they've been working amazing on so many different things, but in particular, they've been doing considerable amount of work in the field already. OSHA's heat illness prevention campaign builds an awareness of strategies and tools for employers and workers. And that's part of the piece of it as well. It's just letting people know what's out there. OSHA included a request for information on heat standard in spring 2021 regulatory agenda. The agency has a heat-related regional emphasis program in the Southwest focused on high hazard industries. And that's what we're going to be doing. So today, the president is launching a coordinated effort, an interagency effort to respond to the extreme heat crisis. Department of Labor and OSHA are playing key roles to better protect and expose workers. OSHA is launching a rulemaking process to develop a workplace heat standard. You can't just go in and arbitrarily make a change. You have to go through a rulemaking process. So OSHA's going to, and I think they did, or they're going to be announcing soon, advance notice for proposed rulemaking on heat illness prevention in outdoor and indoor work settings. This certainly is a significant step towards a federal heat standard to ensure protections in the workplace and across the country. The notice will be published next month in the Federal Register, and it will initiate a comment period following, allowing OSHA to gather diverse perspectives and technical experience. The topics that are going to be included are heat stress thresholds, heating planning and exposing monitoring, implementing and enforcing initiatives on heat-related standards. In addition to a heat-specific standard, OSHA can also use existing tools to protect workers right now in hot indoor and outdoor settings. Through this new enforcement initiative, OSHA will prioritize heat-related interventions in workplace inspections on a day when the heat index exceeds 80 degrees Fahrenheit. Developing a national emphasis program on heat inspections, OSHA is also working to formalize a national emphasis program on heat hazard cases. It will target high-risk industries and focus OSHA on resources, staff, and time and heat inspectors. So, we're going to be forming a heat working group to engage stakeholders and inform people in ongoing efforts. So this is really important as we think about moving forward here. I had a chance a couple weeks ago. I was in Oregon, I should say, and I was talking to some farm worker advocates, and we were talking about a whole bunch of different issues. And the number one issue at that conversation, that we had a round table outside, and the number one issue was heat. And I also come out of the construction industry, and I remember being a younger person working in town on a job down by the waterfront, and the roof on a hot day gets hotter, and upwards of 100 degrees. This is back in the late 80s. So this work that OSHA is doing is long overdue, but the president is making it a priority. Certainly, he's hearing people. So, and I want to thank you and the organization for the great work that you've done as well.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I know that the audience that we have here was very interested to hear about that, especially as I mentioned, given the.
I wish we could be faster. I mean, I'm learning this process here as a Secretary of Labor, and when you're the mayor of Boston, you pretty much say, okay, let's do it, and we do it. And there's this little thing called rulemaking that we can't circumvent. So, but the fact that the President of the United States of America has put a spotlight on this, I think that is a big message from Washington, from the White House, saying that where his heart and concern is.
That's really great. Thank you. I want to move on to something else you touched on in your remarks. This is from Liz Cartier from Oxfam America. She asks, what are the real prospects, underlined real, in this current political environment for increasing the minimum wage, or better yet, passing legislation for a living wage?
Great question. As a mayor, I advocated for a statewide minimum wage in Massachusetts, and we're able to get it through. As mayor of Boston, we're able to, the previous mayor instituted a living wage in the city of Boston in our ordinance, and I was able to keep that forward and actually strengthen that. What amazes me, I've seen, I've been on a lot of calls all day today talking about the minimum wage. It's in the bill process right now. I know that I'm not sure if we're going to be able to get it in the reconciliation package, but it's something that the president's committed to advocating and getting through. When you think about people can't live on $7.45 an hour, $15 an hour minimum wage is even probably suspect in some cases, but we do have to push that floor up. We have to get that law through. I've been talking to advocates and business leaders, and very little pushback on it overall, but we just have to continue to have our voices heard on this. I literally left a Zoom right before this, a webinar with One Fair Wage, and they're an organization pushing for that people shouldn't have to have 2 and 3 and 4 jobs to survive. And $15 an hour minimum wage will help towards that goal. So we're going to keep advocating and keep pushing that. It's something that I know it's long overdue, and hopefully by the time we get it, we won't be advocating for a $30 an hour minimum wage. Hopefully it'll be before that.
Great, thank you. This next question is about labor standards at the state and local level. Peter J. Fugil, apologies for mispronouncing anyone's names during this session, from the University of Illinois, states that a growing number of cities, New York City, Chicago, Philadelphia, have established local offices of labor standards. How do you envision DOL working with state and local labor enforcement agencies to empower workers and improve worker conditions?
I certainly think we need to do a lot more advocacy and partnerships. I think that's something that I mean, I just was on the call. I was on the phone today calling some governors and some Department of Labor across the country on grants that they received from the Women's Bureau. And what I realized when I was talking to the directors of those offices, the ones that I got in touch with, we need a better relationship, and we need to go further down into government as well and partner with mayors, local mayors across the country. Certainly, this cabinet that the president has assembled is really in a good position to do that. It has lots of a few former governors, a few former mayors, former Congress people. So I think that it's going to be vital for us to do that. I mean, I think that some of the best ideas can come out of a local governing body, whether it's a city council or a mayor's a city or something like that, a town. So I think that we have to do more of that, and I don't think we do enough of that. We claim we do, but I think there's a lot more relationship building to do that.
Got it. So many topics to cover. So now we're going to move on to unions, which I know is very important to you and to the department and the administration. Among OECD nations, centralization of bargaining by region and sector is the best predictor of a country having a large and stable middle class, low inequality in general and within firms by race, gender, skill, high levels of employment, trade surpluses, and high levels of leisure time for the working class. This individual goes on to say, but the US collective bargaining system is workplace-based, optional, and only covers 6.5% of the private sector workforce. The only US unions in the private sector that bargain on offense are those like the building trades that functionally bargain sectorally within specific labor markets. They say that the PRO Act contains many pro-labor reforms, but may not come close to establishing sectoral bargaining. So what's the best path forward towards a more sectoral bargaining approach in the US? Well,
I think in a lot of ways that conversation is being had right now in labor unions and affiliates across the country. I think that obviously some unions are very strong on sectoral bargaining. Some unions aren't as strong there, and I think more conversations have to happen. I think at some point, obviously, it's not necessarily in my jurisdiction, but probably should have conversations with the unions about how they move forward. I think the first thing we have to do is pass the PRO Act. I think we can talk about bargaining, sectoral bargaining, individual collective bargaining at some point. That conversation, it'd be great to have that conversation, maybe even debate at some point. But I think right now, when you talk about 6.5% of the workforce that's unionized, we don't want to get too far down the road. I think we still have to do some work. The PRO Act is a priority of President Biden's. He has made it very clear from the very beginning. He's a strong supporter of organizing and allowing people to make a decision whether or not they want to join the union. If we pass the PRO Act, it won't level the playing field, but in some cases it will bring the playing field a little more level. So I think that we have to take one step before we go to the next.
Great. And from your experience addressing the PRO Act, what parts of the PRO Act do you see in particular as tweaking some of the issues that we see that we need in order to reinvigorate the labor movement in the US?
Well, I think when you look at the polling numbers and you see, I might get this wrong, but when you're polling younger people in America, I think millennials and younger, 70% of the population supports collective bargaining and organizing. And that's a very different result as the generation right before it, my generation, and before that and after that. I mean, I grew up in a union family, so I'm very pro-labor. I'm very pro-collective bargaining. I have a union book in my pocket, and I appreciate what a union does. And I think that what the PRO Act would do was help, allow people the opportunity without discrimination, without interference, for them to make up their own minds on whether or not they want to have a union. Now, that's ultimately up to the individuals to do. But I think that, right now in this country, we're seeing a lot around wages. We're seeing a lot of people pushing back and getting more money. We're seeing companies raise wages for entry-level jobs and the jobs that they were paying, minimum wage prior to pandemic. Now they're paying above the minimum wage. Wage growth is good. We just need to continue to treat people respectfully. And I've said this many times, a little off topic, but sometimes people will talk about CEOs making money and say that they're making too much money. I'm not going to complain about how much a CEO makes as long as they're treating their employees fairly. And some of that wage earning, some of that growth and that profit margin that they're getting, reinvest it back in people, reinvest it back in wages, reinvest it back in what moves your company forward. That's what I'd like to see here.
Great, thank you. Moving on, the next question is about the child tax credit. So can you speak about how the child tax credit will support workers and strengthen our economy as a whole? And this question comes from Rakeen Mahmood.
Yeah, thank you for the question. And I think that those folks that are watching today that have gotten a check from the federal government on the child tax credit, lots of poor families are very excited about that. We have an opportunity to literally cut child poverty in half. The president is trying to, through the Build Back Better agenda in the bipartisan infrastructure bill, make this child tax credit permanent. This is probably one of the, in the last 20 years, one of the best things we can do for people that are trying to get into the middle class, quite honestly. And I think that, if you haven't received a child tax credit, you should get in touch with the government. You can contact DOL. We can help you tie you into the right office with the IRS. But we can literally cut child poverty in half. When you think about, lots of people talk about that, and programs could do it, but you talk about the child tax credit, it literally can help families. So we want people to take advantage of that program now. It's your money, and it's an opportunity for us to really help struggling families.
Great, thank you. Somewhat related, so Equitable Growth recently put out a report on childcare and its importance. Alex Goldworth and Sam Abbott were the authors. And I know, Mr. Secretary, you have spoken in the past about how limited access to childcare is one of the factors hindering workers' ability to get back to work. So can you share what you have seen and heard from employers and potential workers regarding how child care access impacts work? And can you address also how advocates and academic researchers in the audience can help make the argument that caregivers and federal support for childcare constitute infrastructure?
Yeah, first and foremost, on the last part of that question, just tell your story. The people on this call, just tell your story, tell you your experiences, your research, your work you've done. Talk to everyone that will listen. I think that's going to be key to spread the information around. I've had an interesting seat when we comes to childcare. I look at, as a mayor of Boston, I had a chance to partner with childcare facilities and programs all across the city of Boston when we were implementing universal pre-kindergarten. And then I also working with, as a state legislator, funding these programs, particularly for low-income families, to make sure they had seats in these programs, and advocate on behalf of these programs, both the nonprofit programs, but also the individual childcare folks that actually do this work at home base. The pandemic came. Many of these childcare facilities around the country were given 2, 3, 4 months of revenue because most of them are based on student participation. And then when 3 or 4 months went by, summertime of 2020, many of the states changed the rules, saying that we'll go back to reimburse you for children that go to the facility. But as you know, in middle of 2020, many families didn't go back to work. Many people didn't go back to work because of the pandemic. And these childcare facilities are hanging on by a thread. President Biden, in his Build Back Better agenda, laid out a plan for strengthening childcare in the United States of America by investing in job training, for the folks that work in those industries, number one. Also putting in place, we'll see what happens in the final version of Congress, but putting in place a maximum of nobody would pay more than 7% of their salary for childcare. That again will help particularly lower income families and middle class people trying to get to the middle class the opportunity to get good, strong childcare with good, strong training of childcare workers, and allow them the opportunity to be able to go to work and be able to be part of the economy. So I think that as we think about this process going through the Build Back Better agenda, they're all important aspects of this bill, but childcare is probably one of the most important. On another note, and I'm sure maybe you've done the study as well, if you look at the outcomes for children at a very young age, children that get a chance to get into high quality, whether it's childcare or high quality pre-kindergarten programs, their outcomes are much better when you get them into quality programs at a very young age, whether it's 2 months or 3 years or 5 years old. The outcomes for those children, at 5 years old is almost too late in some ways. We have to go a lot earlier. So there's a real opportunity here with what the president wants to do and the work that's being done. And just to finish up the last question you asked me about the advocates, and the folks in this industry, please tell your story. I mean, I think that, I go around the country, and unless I'm in a cares economy, a cares conversation with childcare advocates, childcare is brought up, but it's almost like an afterthought. And I know in most cases, it's the number one thought families have. It's the number one thought that women have about getting back in the economy. As I mentioned, the panels right before I came on here. There's 2 million women right now in America that aren't coming back into the workforce. The number one reason I would probably say is childcare. The number two reason is probably fear of, maybe it's elder care, taking care of their older parents or somebody in their family that's older. So those are the areas in our country that we have never really invested in as a government. We've invested in roads and bridges and tunnels and buildings, and that's all great investment. But we have never made investment in the cares economy in people, like what the president's proposing right now. So this changes the trajectory in the United States of America for generations to come if we get this right.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. And I know our time has come to a close, and I think that's a great way to end the session. But before we send you off, just want to say how honored and grateful we are to have had you join us today.
Oh, thanks for having me. And I wish I could stay longer. I want to thank all the participants, everyone watching, and all the panels you have today for the great dialogue and conversation you're having.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, I want to thank again Secretary Walsh, as well as Michelle Holder and Lisa Cook, for such thoughtful and important discussions we have had here on our first day of Equitable Growth's 2021 conference, Evidence for a Stronger Economic Future. And I also want to thank you, all the attendees who have joined us today. Here at Equitable Growth, we believe that it is critical for these types of conversations among policymakers, academics, advocates, and thought leaders to take place, so that we can achieve the best evidence-backed policies to address inequality and foster economic growth. And for your participation from joining us today, to hear from our great speakers, to engaging in our sessions through the Q&A and the chat boxes, it's key to that. Today, we covered a lot of ground. Michelle Holder and Lisa Cook spoke about policies needed to spur stable, strong, and broadly shared growth. We then transitioned to Secretary Walsh, who addressed how to ensure the recovery reaches all workers, particularly as we as a nation confront overlapping racial, climate, and care crises. It's certainly been a productive afternoon, but we're not done yet. Tomorrow, Tuesday, we'd like to invite you all back to join Equitable Growth again for part 2 of our conference. We'll start up at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time and have a jam-packed afternoon for you that is certain to be engaging, I'm sure. On tap, we have a couple fireside chats tomorrow, one with University of California, San Diego's Carlos Fernando Avenancio Leon, where he'll discuss the role of institutional racism in our economy and democracy. And then we'll have another fireside chat at the end of the day with Congressman Hakeem Jeffries, chair of the House Democratic Caucus, who will speak to building a just and competitive economy. We'll also have a bit of a choose your own adventure where you'll get to select between a couple different exciting panels during our concurrent session blocks. Stellar panelists during these sessions include New York Attorney General Letitia James, who will touch on anti-competitive behavior within the tech industry, leading macroeconomist Dr. Olivier Blanchard, who will comment on a new economic future that centers racial equity and climate change within it, and White House officials Brenda Mallory, Shilpa Padkey, and Bharat Ramamurthy, who will speak to a variety of issues from social infrastructure to the intersection of household debt and aggregate demand. We even have a special guest video appearance teed up, so be sure to tune in for that. I know, the suspense. Again, thank you for joining us today. And on behalf of all of the staff at Equitable Growth, we look forward to seeing y'all tomorrow at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time. Have a great rest of your day.